This time on Poll Hub, we're devoting the entire episode to the Civil War. Not the one in the 1860s, but the prospects for a new civil war here in America now. It may sound alarmist or over the top, and perhaps it is, but plenty of very serious and rational people have been looking at the ingredients that have led to modern civil wars around the world, and they have found many of them exist here in America right now. And before you dismiss this, a majority of Americans in recent polling think a new civil war is a real possibility. It's a heady topic, there's a lot to discuss here, so let's get to it. And hi everybody, welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper.
I'm Barbara Carvalho.
And I'm Lee Marengoff.
We have a somewhat weighty topic to discuss today, and we're going to take the whole show to do it. Part of it is a result of polling, our polling and other people's polling, that has shown some real changes in the way that Americans think about their government, the institutions, courts, everything. Part of it is what happened on January 6th. And part of it is a conversation that, at least in my lifetime, I never thought that we would ever have, which is America headed for another civil war? And part of, again, what's driving this is some of the facts on the ground, as it were. Some of it is some writings from people who have looked at civil wars in other countries and other places, and what the components leading up to a civil war are, and whether that recipe is what we're looking at right now. Are we fiddling with those ingredients? So experts who study these things say that we are in a position where a civil war could be real. One of the people who's written about this is UC San Diego political science professor Barbara Walter, who wrote a book, How the Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them. She's been in the media quite a bit. Barb, we found that interesting because she took a kind of a scientific approach, if you will, to this in terms of looking at the data.
Well, I think what I find particularly interesting about this topic, and, we hear it debated, on social media and in all sorts of, different places. And this, I don't think, is to be alarmist or necessarily to, discuss the debate in this country that's going on, but really to focus on what the research has shown over time. And the fact that people have been researching civil wars for quite a long time. Way back when I was in graduate school, we called it political risk analysis, which was looking at countries around the globe. And this was done both for political issues and political relationships, as well as economic relationships. In other words, investments for companies in particular countries, and whether the stability of those governments were significant enough in order to make investments in those countries. And what's come out of a lot of that research is a number of data sets, which have over time have been focusing on the move of countries from what is considered, it's a continuum from autocracy to democracy. And so if you think of a range of intensity between those two poles, one way of looking at countries around the world is where do they fit along those lines? And Barbara Walter in her book does talk about that, but that's not specific just to her. There are a number of research institutes. There are many researchers around the world that study the effects of this. I think what's particularly insightful is the models that have developed from looking at these data sets over time. Just like we have modeling and forecasting to see who's ahead and who's behind for elections in this country, there are lots of models that have been developed to see where countries fit on this move from democracy to autocracy and autocracy to democracy. And I think what's been found is it's very interesting is that a number of countries, particularly those who have moved from dictatorships over the last century or so, which we have seen an incredible growth of liberal democracies around the world and struggling democracies around the world. We see that there is a point at which there is a struggle where they are in between those two poles. And that's what we may be actually looking at right now in this country, that we are now in the middle of those two poles, which in the research jargon means that there is a increased risk of instability in this country.
Let me give you two poll numbers, and then I want to bring in our guest. There's a University of California Davis poll that was done in July. In that, half of Americans agree that at least somewhat, that there will be a civil war in the next few years. In that same poll, nearly 20 million Americans think it's very likely or extremely likely that they will arm themselves with a gun in the next few years in a situation where political violence is justified. Those are the kinds of ominous things that you can see in some ways polls are done that leads us to the reason we're talking about this topic today. Stephen Marche is the author of a book, The Next Civil War, and has written a lot of columns, has been in a lot of the media about this. Stephen, welcome, and thanks for talking about this important subject with us.
Pleasure to be with you.
Tell us a little bit about what you did in this book and in your research, and why you think we may be on a path towards a civil war.
Well, I basically ripped off this television movie series called The Day After, which was actually a piece of fiction published for Congress, where they took the scientific evidence of what a nuclear attack would look like on Lawrence, Kansas, and basically took that wholesale and then created scenarios where you could see what it would do and what it would look like. That's what I've done sort of with the American political collapse, if you will. I don't focus on just the political models, which are the sort of traditional political science paths of, as you say, political risk and factors and the movement to anocracy and so on. That definitely is something I address. But, in my research, what I focused on were sort of all of the models for political collapse. So environmental models, hyper-partisanship models, or specifically the negative partisanship models, which I find very convincing. And I even did, inequality models, a Gini coefficient, and how that relates to political instability, because American inequality is, of course, at such toxic levels now. And, I was proud of myself that I was very clear about the strengths and weaknesses of all of those models. So some of them, like environmental models, are incredibly strong and just have an unbelievable track record, whereas others, like the economic models, are, basically not worth the paper they're written on. Like, if you happen to be right, then you happen to be right, but there's no real validity to them. The negative partisanship model is pretty effective to me. I mean, it has a pretty incredible track record of working. So I, took all these models and then basically imagined scenarios of what they would look like. And that is the book. Really.
And you talk to a lot of folks too.
Yeah. Well, I did my reporting. Like, I went to the places, which of course actually is, it's shocking to me that people who aren't in these places don't see the fall coming. This began when I covered the 2016 inauguration for a Canadian magazine, and it had a very Fall of Rome vibe to me. It was very, violent and very, like the police didn't know what to do. And, suddenly I would go for a cigarette because I was freaking out. And then everyone I was with would be arrested and charged with felonies. Like, it was very chaotic. And so I decided after that point, I'm going to go and see how bad it really is. And that was easily as important to me as the models, right? Like, it is incredibly great to talk to the experts that I've had access to, like the colonel who was responsible for drawing up battle plans of full spectrum operations in the homeland. And the expert on corn who I talked to, who I couldn't sleep for 2 nights after I talked to this cheerful Midwestern farmer about the future of corn. That was actually probably the scariest interview I did, the whole thing. But also because of the way I look and because I grew up in Alberta, white power people are very comfortable talking to me, and I'm very comfortable talking to them. So I was able to get, pretty much access to whoever I wanted to talk to in these far right movements. And that was also very useful in painting a portrait of where things are going.
Yeah, Stephen, we have a lot of ground to cover. Before I jump in, I just would, you referenced the negative partisanship models. And for those who are not of that ilk, you said that those you find particularly useful. Could you just hum a few bars as to what?
Well, the reason I was convinced by it in particular was because their model predicted Trump would win. But when they published their results, they said, there's no way that we can be right. We must be wrong. This model shows that Trump's going to win, but we're publishing it just to show you that the model is obviously broken. Then the model becomes true. Partisanship in the United States increases. Well, they call it complementary radicalization. Is it one way of thinking about it? I think of it as an inverse pendulum. So as the left becomes more radical, the right becomes more radical, and it goes back and forth until, the United States is the textbook example of that, where you now have people defending a president who has nuclear secrets in Mar-a-Lago, and you also have like extreme left, that is also forming, and which is also potentially very threatening.
One of the things I felt in the numbers, I guess this was from our NPR PBS NewsHour poll in July, was that more than 3/4 of Democrats and Republicans see a serious threat to the future of our democracy. I think each side thinks they're the ones who are likely to be the only one who sees it that way. But when you actually ask a national sample, you find out exactly what you're saying. Both
Yeah.
sides are being pulled to a more extreme view of where we are.
Well, the craziest stat that I saw was when they did geolocation with Thanksgiving dinners, and when people were meeting for blue state, red state, like when they were crossing borders for Thanksgiving dinners, Thanksgiving dinner lasted an hour and a half less. Like they literally can't stand to be in the same room with their own family. Well, they don't, and they also won't marry each other. I mean, like literally partisanship is more of a prejudice again for job hiring and things like that than race in America. I mean, think about that. Like think about what that says about the state of where this partisanship is at. I mean, they don't want to marry, they don't want their kids to marry each other. Like it's very, very bitterly divided. And it's the incredible thing is it's only growing more bitter and divided. So that to me just has a lot of like, it has a lot of predictive power, that model. And that's why I used it.
Yeah, a lot of things we have in our politics, of course, and in the economic world are episodic, and then we try to put long trends on them. So how do you react to the following? You mentioned 2016, which obviously was a big deal for a lot of reasons, but how do you react to the notion that Hillary Clinton was the only person Donald Trump could have beaten, and Donald Trump was the only person that Hillary was going to lose to?
Well, I would say that, you know, I say this in my book, and it's one of the hardest things that people find to swallow. But like I say that if Hillary Clinton were elected in 2016, everything that I wrote in the book would also be true. As for the episodic and cyclical nature of this stuff, I mean, God willing, right? From your mouth to God's ear. Like, let's hope that you're going to see this book 10 years from now in a used bookstore and be like, who was that idiot? I mean, let's all pray that happens.
It's more likely not going to be allowed in certain red states to be.
Right. I mean, you know, I do think that the chances of a peaceful transition of power or an agreed on result of the 2024 election to me is very slim, right? At this point, and certainly by 2028. And that will make that much more toxic. I mean, you know, I would also say that when I wrote this book, the year that I was thinking of was like 2040. It wasn't like 2024, right? Like it was not and I think part of that is because I couldn't go to the States to report during COVID. Like I wasn't in the United States for like almost a year and a half, which was not like I was usually there all the time, right? And when I remember showing it to like a reporter who is just a great reporter for Politico, but before when I was talking to him, he was at the Tampa Bay paper. And I showed him this book, an early draft, and I said, what do you think? And he said, look, I think you're right, but you don't know how quickly this is accelerating on the ground. And I thought he was crazy, but you know, I think he was probably right. Like,
How much does social media provide some of that acceleration?
You know, I wanted to write a whole chapter on social media. And I wrote, Is Facebook Making Us Lonely for The Atlantic years ago. And I had a whole bunch of theories about it. But then when I looked at the information, it doesn't really fit because like Canada has much more Facebook uptake and much more social media than the United States. And there's just as much social media in places like Germany and Sweden and so on, but there's nowhere near the kind of political discourse that flows from that. And I mean, I think one of the reasons is like, you know, when the Russians came for our foreign minister, the conservative member of parliament stood up and said, no one should report on this. It is a complete smear. Ignore it. And I think this happened in Germany and in other places too, where it's like, you know, we're not going to be pushed around by foreign powers on social media. And sort of the entire political class agreed to that. Whereas in the United States, they just opened the door to it. Right. And it's the question of what is the will to do that, right? Like, why when you go to Trump rallies, do you see people wearing shirts that say, I'd rather be a Russian than a Democrat, right? Like that's not on Facebook, you know, like certainly Facebook is a toxic part of this stew, but honestly, like when I'm trying to figure out like what are the actual causes of civil war, like what causes this to go on, I couldn't really find a strong case to make against social media. And I wanted to, like, I went looking for it. You know?
So you in your book have 5 scenarios that you laid out, 5 different scenarios for how we end up in civil war. Which of how'd you decide on the 5, and which of those seems at this point most likely?
Well, I'd say one, which is a amalgam of right-wing forces join up to resist government mandates on a bridge sort of already happened, right? Like that was, I mean, I didn't get where it would happen. Like I didn't know it would happen on the bridge in Windsor, but like they literally in the book, they congregate on a bridge. Like that did happen in Windsor, Ontario over COVID protocols.
But we haven't gotten to Civil War yet. So check one. We got through one.
Well, Civil War, you have to understand, like Civil War in this definition is not red coats versus blue coats versus gray coats with a border line. We're talking about elevations of violence where like Prio's definition of it starts at 1,000 combatant deaths a year. So when you think of like the massacre in Buffalo, which was, explicitly basically a pogrom, like political violence to keep down a population, that's not even registered in the statistics of what you would call a civil war, or the guy shooting at the FBI building. Those aren't really registering yet. But
so are we already there?
Well, I do think it would have to be upgraded from a projection to incipient at the very least, right? Like, I mean, I think it is not something like political breakdown in the United States is not something that is, you have to fantasize about. Like, you can see it. Like you have Texas Texas Republicans arguing for secession openly. Inconceivable. How long ago? 5 years ago? I mean, like inconceivable. And
well, I don't know. I don't know. As New Yorkers, we always figure that, if somebody wants to secede, power to them. So we
but
often
you never used to say it.
them.
I remember when the Washington Post ran a piece that was like, if Texas wants to go, let them go. I was like, you're running that stuff now? Like before you thought it for sure. But you never ran it, right? Like you never actually thought it's okay to publish this, like goodbye Texas, and I think that is accelerated. Like the thing is, I studied the right mostly. Like these are the people I was mostly talking to. They've been thinking about civil war for a long time, forever. Like conversations like this have absolutely been part of the conservative entertainment complex since 2008, really.
And certainly sooner than that with the rise of talk radio, sure.
Well, yeah. 2008, most scholars date it from there. Like most of the people I talked to were like, what's the roots of this? I mean, you can go back to 1870, if you say 1877, if you want to. You can go back to you're a revolutionary country, and revolutionary countries have more bloodshed, right? Like that's true of Algeria. That's true of a lot of other countries. But when you ask scholars, like, where did this start? Like the answer is almost always 2008, because of the housing crisis, because of Barack Obama's election and the change to the presidential iconography. But, and I also think the surge in Iraq, the failure of the surge in Iraq is a huge reason too. But before then, like there were Texas separatists. They lived in the desert and they would occasionally get in gunfights with local authorities. They were not, sitting Republican governors who are patrolling the borders. This is very different affair.
Well, I was just going to ask: are there solutions to any of this?
Oh, I mean, yeah, like there are a lot of things that could take America off the high boil that it's on, like open primaries for starters, independent redistricting groups that are
ranked choice voting.
Ranked choice voting. I mean, there's a lot of things that could take America off the high boil, but you have to want to go off the high boil, right? You have to like actually want to not do this. And I think what I see is that will to chaos really is there, right? And like there's and I don't know what the solution to that is. I think when you look at the case of Michigan, which actually did take some pretty impressive steps, like when the governor nearly gets kidnapped, you have all this true political insanity going on. They took some pretty proactive steps to rein it in, and I definitely say it's a qualified success. Right. Like that's a model to look at. I was very disappointed in Biden's recent speech, even though he did acknowledge that for the first time, he was like, we are in serious trouble here as democracy, which I think is important. But like his next thing, his solution is to call on the American people. I mean, please, like, that's not that's not a real solution at all. Like calling on the will of the spirit of the American people. Like, come on, we need real solutions here. And they're not to better Americans. Like that's not what it is.
Let me ask you a couple quick hits. One of the items you talk about is rooting out domestic terrorism. Has the failure of the recent attempts by, storming the Capitol and all that, and the arrests of all these, Proud Boys and
Oath Keepers,
all that, is that in some ways, should I feel that domestic terrorist leaders have at least been rooted out a little bit?
They're getting elected in Arizona in primaries. I mean, like, yes, arresting the traitors is a good idea, but like,
Well,
like arresting people who are guilty of treason is good, but I don't think it's really enough. On the other hand, I don't mean to criticize the Department of Justice, because rooting out domestic terrorism is really hard. It is extremely hard.
Donald Trump is indicted and arrested. What does that do the next day to America, do you think?
I mean, there are no good answers to this. Like, if you're arresting ex-president, but I mean, you can't have nuclear secrets floating around people's.
No, I get that.
You can't have it. It absolutely ups the temperature, but I don't really think there's a choice. I mean, you can't have people floating around with nuclear classified documents in their ties and socks. Like, it's just not acceptable.
I told you I had 14 questions, not really that many.
Yeah.
How annoyed or accurate do you think it is that when something happens in America today, people go back to the 1930s Germany model and say, you see, we're right where we were then. That's just like Kristallnacht, what happened in Charlottesville.
Yeah.
Does that ring true to you, those kind of analogies, or do you think that's jumping the gun a little?
I don't think that the Nazi Germany model is particularly good. I mean, that is really one thing where Barbara's book is really excellent at parallels and analogs with other nations. Like, I think, to me, closer parallels would be places like Chile in the 70s, where hyper-partisanship overwhelmed the Supreme Court and you have illegitimacy coming in. I mean, the truth is, like, the Nazi situation in Germany is a very particular historical situation that's never really been recreated. And I don't think it's like, when people call the Trumpists fascist, I mean, that to me is very ahistorical. You're just calling them bad guys, right? Like, fascism is a very specific political movement that has, I don't see anywhere near the kind of policy focus that the fascists had in Trumpism. Like, it's much closer to world wrestling. So yeah, I mean, the Nazi comparison is actually quite weak. I mean, that doesn't mean that, what's happening is good. Like, it's just not like that. Like, I think what happened in Chile was pretty, was horrific too. So, I don't find that analogy very useful.
I will say that this has been, I think, a wonderfully illuminating discussion, and the time has flown by. I will say in closing, when I was in 7th grade in a conservative junior high school during the 60s, the kids were wearing "I'd rather be dead than red."
Right.
And now I'm saying those same people are probably saying, not so much.
Right.
Well, they're the I'd rather be Russian than a Democrat.
I'd rather be Russian than Democrat. It's gone all full circle.
The
I
other thing
mean,
I found
geez.
interesting was that, and I don't remember the author, but when I was a freshman in college, which was 1960,
A long time ago.
long time ago, my introduction to political science course, there was a book about radical right-wing movements in the United States, but they were more of what became the Branch Davidian kind, or the guys up in the hills who are plotting this, not the kind of thing where you're seeing these marches in public. I just thought I'd throw those two things in.
Yeah.
Well, also, one of the things that I think that the U.S. probably has going for it, and I agree, the Civil War has a lot of definitions. And so, again, it's much better to look at that on a continuum as just we are or we aren't. But it's also that we do start as a democracy, not as an autocracy. So at least the institutions themselves and the power as it is centralized right now makes it a little bit more difficult for some of
Absolutely.
those
I mean,
other.
the number one metric that leads to autocracy or coup is that you've had a coup, right? And it's by far the dominant thing, right? Like, everything else is like 10%.
We'd love to
Right.
have you on again, Stephen. We'd love to have you on again, but please, the next time, I don't want to see you with several suitcases packed heading for the border.
Buddy, I'm already in
He's
Canada.
in Canada.
Oh,
Yeah.
I
We
mean,
need-
I'll be screwed too, but
It's-
we're gonna be screwed up here too. But I mean, my ancestors packed their bags in 1812, man. I mean, we knew it was coming.
Yeah, Lee, I think the statement to add is the next time we see you, we may be at your doorstep with our suitcases. How about
I
that?
have I mean,
We're
during
not-
early COVID, I got some really freaked out phone calls from American friends, I must say. And it was really like, can you get me across the border? And I was like, no, I can't. I mean, it was really amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, we have a lot. We've got a little American diaspora right in my neighborhood right now, actually.
Well, Stephen Marche, thanks for joining us. You're the author of the book, The Next Civil War, Dispatches from the American Future. I don't think I've ever said this to one of our guests before, but I sure as hell hope you are wrong.
Me too. Me too. God willing. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for your time.
Pleasure.
That'll do it for this edition of Poll Hub.
Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Merritt Griffith is our executive producer.
Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review. Positive reviews help other listeners like you find us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal.
If you have questions for us, tweet them directly to @MaristPoll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub, and with any luck, it will cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button.
Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as we release it.
We'll see you next time.